Sorry about that, babe.
You know, I might be late to the party, but better late than never. Finally breaking free of my replay earlier games in the series paralysis, I managed to finish Dragon Warrior 3 on the NES almost right at the end of 2024. And you know what? I was impressed. Developed by Chunsoft and published by Enix, Dragon Warrior 3, otherwise known as Dragon Quest 3, was released in North America on the NES in March of 1992. Now, I want to reiterate that this is going to be going over the NES version, not any of the remakes. I do hope to get to the remakes at some point in the distant future, but we're going to focus on the OG North American release for now. The story. Dragon Warrior 3 takes place many years before the events of the original Dragon Warrior in a different world altogether. You, the hero, gets awoken on your 16th birthday by your mother in your home country of Aliahan. You are the son, or daughter, of the legendary warrior Ortega, and you are now summoned to speak to the king of Aliahan. The king petitions you to follow in the footsteps of your brave father to slay the enemy, the archfiend Baramos. The king lets you know that you can go to the local eatery to put together a squad, you are given some gold, and then you're on your own. Throughout your journey, you'll be battling perilous foes, traversing dungeons, climbing towers, gathering keys, orbs, and other enchanted items, and even visiting a different world altogether. Now, despite being the third game in the series, Dragon Warrior 3 doesn't have an insanely intricate story, but what is there, including all the side stories, quests, and twists, it did a good job of keeping me in tune and wanting to explore what lies ahead. And for fans of the series, there will be plenty of smiles at the end. Graphics. The graphics of Dragon Warrior 3 will seem very familiar to series veterans. Thankfully, there were some improvements that are quite noticeable, even if subtle to the casual game goer. The first thing that you'll probably notice is the fact that the characters and NPCs have received a bit of a glow up. Not some insane overhaul, but there is an extra level of detail that wasn't present in the previous installment. Also worth noting, things such as the details in the areas like the throne rooms, in Middenhall Castle in Dragon Warrior 2 for example, the general design of the thrones are flat, where in Aliahan they appear much more detailed, three-dimensional, and the like. This level of detail is also seen in minor things such as the background drapes. I could point out a bunch of examples, but I think you kinda get the picture. Although the game itself looks almost the same, that extra level of detail shows the advancement of the graphical fidelity in the years that have gone by. Another area of noticeable graphical improvement is on the overworld. Everything, again, is a bit more detailed, colorful, and feels more alive, especially during the new day-to-night transition system. The battle screens are basically the same from Dragon Warrior 2 with the black background, but the enemy sprites were also aided by said improvements, just slightly more detailed, ferocious looking or goofy in some aspects, and filled with color. There are even a few instances of really trippy transition sequences to add to the luster. Now, I don't want to sound like a broken record, so I'll just stop right there, but the improvements are clearly there, at times subtle, and are very much welcomed. Music and sound. Composer Koichi Sugiyama returns to yet again deliver a very solid and memorable sound array. Quickly touching on the sound effects, overall pretty standard. Confirmation on dialogue boxes, hits, spells, etc., they all seem very familiar and get the point across. The little jingles throughout the game, such as the blowing of flutes, resting at the inns, resurrecting your dead characters at the houses of healing, and so on, they help add that extra layer of charm to the game. Wrapping back around to the soundtrack, much like the graphics and overall gameplay, Dragon Warrior 3 felt slightly improved, yet still familiar in a good way. The first track that I wanted to shout out was the battle theme. I won't lie, when I first heard it, I wasn't a fan for some reason, but after an hour or two it quickly grew on me. It was more fast-paced than the Dragon Warrior 2 battle theme, frenetic and sporadic, and man, it really gets the job done. Another great track was one of the caves. It feels tense, dreadful, mysterious, and even groovy, with the hope of great treasure and a timely exit. I gotta say that this comes off as one of the finer 8-bit dungeon themes that I could think of. It's not over-the-top spectacular by any means, but it accomplishes exactly what it set out to do. You also have incredibly fitting themes such as that in the pyramid, when you're sailing, the final battle theme, or of the Eastern-themed village of Jaipang. And of course that traditional Dragon Warrior intro theme, and even a reprise/remix of A Forgotten Land. Kudos for, again, another great soundtrack. Controls. I feel like I could pretty much just copy and paste what I had for my Dragon Warrior 2 review here, but we'll mix it up a little bit at least. The controls in Dragon Warrior 3 are fairly standard in terms of navigation in towns, dungeons, and the overworld. The menuing, while simple, could still be pretty clunky at times in terms of inventory management, usage, and so on. Surprisingly, I didn't really have too many misclicks in battle, and again, in general, they are pretty Dragon Warrior status quo. The only cruddy thing is that Dragon Warrior 3 still has that slight feel of delay or unresponsiveness in the controls that the previous entries had. It's nothing insanely pronounced, but it's noticeable, at least to me. Either way, not a deal breaker. Gameplay and fun factor. Now, these are the attributes that set Dragon Warrior 3 apart from the previous two entries in the series in a big way. The biggest thing is the general party construction and classes. Unlike the first two games where you were either solo, or in Dragon Warrior 2 where you had a defined party of 3, the world is truly your oyster in Dragon Warrior 3. Your main character is locked into the hero class, which is your well-rounded warrior being overall very powerful, with the ability to use magic spells and wield a lot of equipment. Beyond that, you have the choice of the fighter, who is strong and boasts high agility at the loss of not being able to use a variety of equipment, the soldier, who is your traditional slower tank with great equipment variety, the merchant, who is decent, is able to find extra gold, appraise items, at the cost of being slow, the pilgrim, who is well-rounded, learns a variety of spells, namely of the healing variety, can equip a decent amount of gear, where really the only negative I experienced was a weakened attack in the late game, the goof-off, whose claim to fame is high luck and the ability to natively class change into a sage, but otherwise, honestly garbage. And the wizard, who I'm sure you can infer is a magical powerhouse that's physically weak and can't use a ton of equipment. And last but not least, the sage, who is sort of a secret class that could either be promoted with the use of a Book of Satori item or natively from the goof-off class. The sage is basically the GOAT, learning the spells that both the pilgrim and wizard could learn, while being a pretty good fighter and having the choice of decent equipment. Now, this is the 1000-foot overview of the class system. You can of course get way more intricate and granular, and if you're looking for that, this probably isn't the video for you. I just wanted to go over it all as concisely as possible. I touched on it briefly with the Sage class, but coupled with the class choices is the ability to change classes. Roughly around the midpoint of the game, you could change your classes at the Shrine of Dhamma, as long as your character is at level 20. The main reasons for class changing? Well, the most obvious would be you pick the class that you feel doesn't suit your needs or playstyle and you want to change. Or you can maximize your character's abilities by class changing. Some examples of intriguing class changes would include the following. A fighter into a soldier, or a pure physical powerhouse. The fighter's agility and luck can transfer over a bit to the soldier, who levels up quicker and can use better gear. Or perhaps changing a wizard into a sage, retaining high intelligence points and becoming a very well-rounded spellcaster with more physical oomph. Changing classes does not come without a cost though. When you change a class, your character's level will reset to 1 and their stats will be halved. Granted, leveling up at that point will be very quick and easy. Long story short, the class system, class changes, and the Sage class make for a very interesting set of gameplay mechanics. I also feel like the dungeons took a step up in Dragon Warrior 3. There were some with multiple entry points like the Tower of Najima, which by the way has a literal friggin' inn on the inside. There's dungeons with floor fall mechanics, misdirection tile mechanics like in the Tower west of Kol, and the final dungeon, brutal but rewarding jaunts like through the Cave of Necrogond, and even a few throwback style ones late in the game. I personally really enjoyed the variety, and the fact that you could beeline through a bunch of them if you don't want to explore and loot. It's your choice. Dragon Warrior 3 to me was also far more descriptive, whether that be in-game or with the included guidebook, or prior knowledge from the first two entries. Dragon Warrior and Dragon Warrior 2 were by far more cryptic to me, and I felt this game was a lot easier to navigate, and if you did get lost, there were many opportunities to be redirected by various dialogues. And this is a pretty important point because Dragon Warrior 3 is not a small game by any means. It felt similar-ish in size to Dragon Warrior 2's vast world map, with more areas, and an entirely different world map near the end of the game. This descriptive nature also plays into the general dialogue and storytelling. I feel like Dragon Warrior 3 did quite a lot with so little in terms of the narrative. It's not superfluous, and it gets the point across. A few areas that stood out to me were Jaipang and Tadanki that had side stories / quests that stuck with me. Dragon Warrior 3 also has wonderful replay value. You could do things like class randomizers or solo runs for fun challenge run ideas. There are also tons of opportunities for rare drop farming like the animal suits and even Books of Satori. There are even instances of being able to do things in your own order. For example, I went to the Tower of Champagne first and got the crap kicked out of me. Then I went to the cave west of Noniel's instead. You could easily mix and match there. Another aspect that could play into replay value is the day-to-night cycle. Obviously, on the surface, the graphics change during this cycle, and oftentimes the king is asleep and you cannot save without passing time or resting at an inn. But beyond that, during nighttime, people will appear in different spots in the towns. New dialogue can come from this, and even areas like the aforementioned Tadanki are literally only open and pumping at nighttime. Early on in the game, time passage could be mildly annoying, but as the game progresses you could find the Lamp of Darkness or learn the spell Day-Night to push things along, though admittedly a bit too far along in the game for my taste. There were also a couple of fun things that I wanted to shout out, such as the New Town area on the eastern side of the map. You know, the one where you take a merchant there, you leave them, they'll build up the town, which then leads to a pretty funny side story in the emergence of a required item. Then there were also the monster battling arenas, which, to be fair, I didn't mess around with too much, but I could see them being pretty fun, especially if you're a degenerate gambler looking to make or lose quick gold. Or hey, maybe you're just looking to kill some time in game. And lastly, for the most part, I felt like the difficulty was just right on in Dragon Warrior 3. There were only a few areas that I felt were perhaps overly punishing. Otherwise, I was able to progress at a decent clip. I didn't find it to be too easy, too hard. For the most part, it was just right and rewarding. One thing that I did not feel was the grind slog that I did in the first 2 entries. In fact, many instances had me wanting to grind, especially with the class change function and there being so many good places to earn easy experience. Also, for reference, I was able to fell the final boss on my first attempt without some insane final dungeon pre-grind, so that was pretty awesome. Critiques. As much as I loved Dragon Warrior 3, there were definitely a few rough edges that bugged me and I wanted to point them out. Menuing is still pretty clunky in this entry. I had many annoyances throughout my journey, especially with depositing items into the vault, trying to remember who has what, and so forth. Now, I don't consider this a death sentence or anything for the game. Most retro RPGs have issues with menuing, inventory, and whatnot, so it is what it is, but still annoying. Another minor annoyance that I had is I wish that you were specifically told what spells you learned when you leveled up. I kinda figured at this point they'd be able to throw a few different characters onto the screen like, hey, Bits learned Heal More. The way that the spell screens get laid out in-game, it can be easily forgotten what spell you just learned unless you look right away and keep a note of it somewhere. Also, I didn't really notice this during my playthrough, but I guess the Vitality and Intelligence seeds in the game were broken. Those are some of those items that you use and you have a randomized level up of a certain stat, in this case Vitality and Intelligence. The super succinct version here is don't bother using the Vitality and Intelligence seeds. They could actually stunt your character's growth. And I also have a funny note. It's not a critique, I just wanted to point it out and make fun of myself. For some reason I thought the Acorns of Life were the revival items. I don't know why. I completely forgot that they raise your HP, so I didn't use them at all during my run. What a moron. And I didn't really touch on it in the gameplay and fun factor section because for the most part the battle mechanics of Dragon Warrior 3 are very similar to that of Dragon Warrior 2. This includes that attack style where you attack the air if a previously entered attack or spell goes towards a now dead enemy or enemy group. Don't get me wrong, this is a personal preference. Some people love that style because it adds a little bit more thinking to some of the battles. I, on the other hand, do prefer the more brainless auto-redirect attack feature that a lot of RPGs have. Again, to each their own, but I did stand my ground on this for Dragon Warrior 2, so I'll stand it here again. Admittedly though, a lot of those are very nitpicky, but I will say that these final 2 gripes are my biggest gripes with the game. The first is the pacing and difficulty towards the beginning of the game is punishing. The Tower of Champagne in the Noniel's Cave areas can be absolutely brutal. And this was actually with a few grind sessions during this alongside natural progression. At that point I was scared that the rest of the game would be tough as nails. Thankfully it felt like it leveled out for me after that. Also, shout out to the Tower of Garuna Metal Slime grind. And of course natural progression in the late game, these were big helps. And lastly, the encounter rate is all over the place. There will be times where every single step that you take is an encounter, and other times where you could seemingly run a marathon and nothing will even sniff in your general direction. I just wish that it was a little bit more consistent, because when it's bad, it's bad. Other than that though, Dragon Warrior 3 is awesome. In summation. Now, this isn't exactly groundbreaking news. The Dragon Warrior / Quest franchise is insanely popular for a reason. But having only previously played the first 2 entries, and enjoying them, Dragon Warrior 3 was an amazing progression and step up. A vast world, with an awesome class system, reasonable difficulty, great replay value, slightly improved music and graphics, and in my opinion a little bit less grind than the previous entries. What's not to love? I give Dragon Warrior 3 on the NES a 9.25 out of 10. Up until this point in the series, it's very clear that this is the best of the bunch, despite my undying love for the charm of the first entry. I am very excited to get the Dragon Warrior 4 sometime this year to close out the series on the NES, finally, after all these years. And of course, yes, I will get to the litany of Dragon Warrior / Quest 3 remakes at some point in the future as well. If you've enjoyed this review, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you haven't already. If you want to see more Dragon Warrior content, check out the pinned comment, description, or end screen below, where you can see all of my Dragon Warrior 1, 2, and 3 coverage to this point. Take care.